I built every room in that house thinking about you, and I don't even know your name yet." Xavier Zimmerman said those words to nobody. He said them to the wind, to the empty door frame, to the silence that answered him every single morning for 3 months straight. He drove the last nail into the porch railing, stepped back and looked at what his hands had made, and felt the most crushing loneliness of his young life. A house was standing. A home was not. So he saddled his horse, put $17 in his shirt pocket, and rode toward Fort Smith to find the woman he'd built it for. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow it all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Xavier Zimmerman was 26 years old, and he had already built more than most men twice his age would ever attempt. 160 acres of Arkansas frontier land, bought at government price. A barn with solid crossbeams and a roof that didn't leak. A well dug 14 feet through hard clay. And a house 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a proper window above the basin, a front porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs side by side. He had built every inch of it alone. Every morning he woke before the sun touched the eastern ridge, boiled his coffee in a tin pot, and worked until his hands bled through the calluses. Every evening he sat on that front porch in one rocking chair, always one, always on the left, and listened to the silence come in off the land like a tide. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a house that knew it was supposed to be full and wasn't. He told himself it didn't bother him. He was wrong. The idea had started practical. A man alone on a frontier ranch was a man at risk. No one to send for help if a horse threw him. No one to work the second field while he managed the first. No one to keep accounts when he rode to market. That was the sensible argument. He'd made it to himself 100 times. But the real argument was simpler and harder to say out loud. He was lonely in a way that had started to feel permanent. His neighbor old Clem Bartlett had ridden over one Sunday in August, taken a long look at the house and said, "Boy, you're either building a home or building a monument to your own stubbornness." "Which is it?" Xavier had said home. Clem had squinted at him. "Then you're missing the most important piece." Xavier knew what piece Clem meant. He just hadn't figured out how to get it. It was a Tuesday morning in early September when he finally made the decision. He'd woken up, poured his coffee, walked out to the porch, and stood there in the blue pre-dawn, looking at the land he'd shaped and the house he'd raised. And something in his chest had simply said enough. Enough waiting, enough working alone, enough rocking in one chair when 2 chairs sat there side by side. He went inside, counted what he had $17.40 in a tobacco tin, and started pulling on his boots. He didn't have a plan exactly. He had a direction: Fort Smith. It was the closest town of real size 40 miles east, and it had churches and boarding houses and businesses and people, and somewhere inside all of that, he told himself there had to be a woman willing to build something out of hard ground and honest effort. He saddled his horse, a big gray quarter horse named Drum, and rode out without looking back at the house. He was afraid if he looked back, he'd lose his nerve. Fort Smith hit him like a wall of noise and smell after 3 months of frontier quiet. He'd been to town before, but always briefly to buy supplies to file paperwork at the land office to sell a cord of wood in the spring. He'd never looked at it the way he looked at it now, which was the way a man looks at a place when he's asking something from it. The main street was mud and wagon ruts and horses and voices. A blacksmith worked a bellows 2 doors down from a dry goods shop. Children ran between legs. Women in long dresses moved with purpose from one errand to the next. A group of men stood outside the saloon at an hour that seemed too early for drinking, and yet Xavier rode Drum down the main street, slowly watching everything, and felt for the first time since he'd made the decision that morning, genuinely uncertain about what he was doing. He tied Drum at the post outside the general store and went inside to buy a paper collar and a bar of decent soap, because whatever else he was about to do, he wasn't going to do it, looking like he'd just come in from 3 months of frontier labor, even though he had. The woman behind the counter was broad-shouldered and no-nonsense, with gray-streaked hair and glasses. She looked at his hands when she made change. "Rancher," she said. "Yes, ma'am." New spread east of the Bartlett property. She nodded like that told her something. You in town for supplies or for trouble? Neither, Xavier said. I'm looking for someone. She gave him a look that managed to be both skeptical and curious. Someone specific or someone general? He felt his ears go warm. General? I suppose. She handed him his change and his package and said without particular warmth or coldness, Try the church first. Reverend Aldrich keeps track of the respectable families, and for the love of patience, don't walk into this looking desperate. Men who look desperate get taken advantage of or turned away flat. Look like you've got something worth offering. I've got land, Xavier said. Land is a start, she said. It is not a finish. ABC. He found the church on the north end of town, white clapboard neat, the kind of building that made an effort and waited until the afternoon when he'd been told the Reverend saw visitors. Reverend Aldrich was a thin man in his 60s with a handshake like a vice grip and eyes that weighed you without seeming to try. Xavier sat across from him in a small office that smelled of old books and candle wax and stated his situation as plainly as he could. I've got 160 acres, a solid house, a barn, a well, and livestock enough to start a working ranch. I'm 26. I don't drink except occasionally. I don't gamble, and I've never hit a woman or an animal out of anger. I'm looking for a wife. I'm looking for someone who wants a real life built on real work, not a fairy story. The Reverend studied him for a long moment. That's an honest speech, he said at last. Most men come in here selling themselves like snake oil salesmen. You're selling yourself like a hardware catalog. I figured honest was better. It usually is, the Reverend said, though it's not always more attractive. He folded his hands. There are 2 women in this congregation whose situations might lead them to consider what you're describing. I'll speak to their families on your behalf. Come back Thursday. Xavier came back Thursday. The first woman was Clara Whitfield, 23, well-kept with a father who ran a hardware business, and a manner that was pleasant but careful. She agreed to a walk. They walked. She asked him about the house, and he described it, and she listened politely. Then she said, How far is it from town? 40 miles. Something shifted in her expression. Not rudeness, just a quiet calculation. And the nearest neighbor, Clem Bartlett, about 2 miles. Another pause. I grew up in this town, she said. I know everybody here. I know the name of every dog on every street. She looked at him with something like regret. I don't think I could be 40 miles from all of it. Not for long. I think I'd grieve myself into nothing. He respected her for saying it plainly. He told her so. They shook hands like colleagues, and that was that. The second woman was Sarah Holt, a widow 31, with a brisk manner and sharp opinions, and 2 years of managing on her own since her husband had died of fever. Xavier found her admirable immediately. She was exactly the kind of woman who could build something. They talked for an hour at the boarding house parlor, and it went well, right up until she said, I want to be clear about one thing. I will not be managed. I will not be directed. I will be a partner, or I will be nothing. That's what I want, Xavier said immediately. She looked at him with something like surprise. Most men say that. Very few mean it. I'm not most men. No, she said slowly. I don't think you are. She was quiet for a moment. But I want you to understand something, Mr. Zimmerman. I spent 2 years building my independence. A very specific kind of independence in this town, where I know the people, where I have credit at the dry goods store, where the doctor knows my name. What you're offering me is a trade. I give up what I've built here, and I start over out there. She met his eyes directly. I'm not willing to make that trade. Not yet. Not with a stranger. That was fair, too. He knew it was fair. He thanked her for her honesty and walked back out into the afternoon and stood on the church steps, feeling the particular exhaustion of a man who has done everything right and still failed. He stood there long enough that a boy selling newspapers looked at him twice. He told himself he'd try once more the next day. He'd ask around, see if there was anyone else the Reverend might recommend, anyone in town who might be in a situation that matched his own. He wasn't ready to give up. He wasn't going home to that empty porch without at least finishing what he'd started. That evening, he ate supper at the only decent restaurant on the main street, a place called Reed's, run by a woman named Molly Reed, who had opinions about everything and shared them freely with anyone sitting at her counter. The restaurant was warm and loud and smelled of roasting meat and coffee. Xavier sat at the counter and ordered the stew and a plate of cornbread and tried not to think too hard about the 2 conversations he'd had that day. He was halfway through the stew when Molly Reed set a coffee cup in front of him and said without preamble, "You've got the look of a man who asked a woman something today and got told no." Xavier looked up. Molly was 50 stout, with the kind of face that had laughed a great deal and worried a great deal, and hadn't let either one win entirely. "Is it that obvious?" he said. "Only to someone paying attention," she said. "What did you ask?" He told her. Not all of it, just the shape of it. The ranch, the house, the 2 women, the 2 polite refusals. Molly listened without interrupting, which he guessed was unusual for her. When he finished, she refilled his coffee and was quiet for a moment. "You're not going about it wrong," she said finally. "You're just looking in the wrong direction. The women the Reverend sends you to are women with options, Mr. Zimmerman, Xavier Zimmerman, Mr. Zimmerman. Women with options choose carefully, and carefully usually means safely, and safely usually means near town. If you want someone who might actually choose a frontier ranch, you want someone whose other options aren't so comfortable." Xavier looked at her steadily. "You're not saying I should look for someone desperate." "No," Molly said firmly. "I'm saying desperate and backed into a corner are 2 very different things. Desperate is a weakness. Backed into a corner, that's someone who needs a door, not charity." She picked up the coffee pot and moved down the counter to refill another cup, and when she came back, she said very casually, "My waitress, for instance, Olivia Norton. She's not desperate, but she's not comfortable either." Xavier followed Molly's glance without being obvious about it. The woman moving between the tables was perhaps 24 or 25. She was slender, brown-haired, with a way of moving that was efficient and quiet. She refilled a glass, collected a plate, answered a question, all without calling attention to herself. She had a stillness about her that wasn't shyness exactly. It was more like someone who had learned to take up less space. But it was her eyes that stopped him when she turned briefly in his direction. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking through him at the kitchen door, and yet he caught something in that instant that he couldn't name. Not sadness exactly. More like someone who had decided sadness was a luxury and had put it somewhere safe and was carrying on without it. "What's her story?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Molly's expression shifted, still open, but with a new carefulness to it. "That's hers to tell," she said. "What I'll tell you is that she's been working for me 8 months. She's honest, she's steady, and she's got enough sense to know a bad situation from a good one." She gave him a long, appraising look. "Whether you're a good situation remains to be seen." He didn't approach Olivia that night. Something in him, some instinct that had served him well in difficult negotiations with livestock and weather and stubborn clay, told him that approaching her directly that evening, in her workplace in front of the other customers, was exactly the wrong move. Instead, he ate the rest of his stew, thanked Molly, left a 15-cent tip when he could barely afford it, and went back to the boarding house where he was paying 30 cents a night for a cot and a thin blanket. He lay on the cot, looking at the ceiling, and thought about a woman with quiet eyes and a stillness that looked like something protected. In the morning, he went back to Reed's for breakfast. Molly was behind the counter. Olivia was clearing the tables. He ordered coffee and eggs and ate without rushing. When Molly came by to refill his cup, she said very quietly, "I spoke to her this morning." Xavier set down his fork. "You did. I told her a rancher had come in looking for a wife. I told her he was not stupid, not cruel, and not trying to buy anyone. I told her he had land, and a house, and some decency." Molly set the coffee pot down on the counter. "She asked me what he looked like. I told her he looked like a man who was used to working hard and not getting much back for it." Xavier wasn't sure if that was a compliment. "What did she say?" She said she'd talk to him, if he asked right. He nodded slowly. What's asking right? Molly almost smiled. Don't flatter her. Don't make promises you can't keep. And for the love of God, don't look at her like she's the solution to your problem. Look at her like she's a person who might help you solve it. There's a difference. He thought about that. There is, he agreed. He came back at noon, when the lunch crowd had thinned, and Olivia was wiping down tables near the window. He didn't sit at the counter. He took the table closest to where she was working, sat down, and waited until she came to take his order. Miss Norton, he said when she arrived. My name is Xavier Zimmerman. Mrs. Reed may have mentioned me. She looked at him for a moment without expression. Up close, she was older than he'd first thought, not in years, but in experience. There were things in her eyes that had been put there by events, not by time. She may have, Olivia said. I'd like to speak with you plainly if you're willing, he said. Not here necessarily, wherever's proper, at your convenience. What would you like to speak about? He looked up at her directly. About whether two people who both need a different life might be useful to each other. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll have 15 minutes at 2 o'clock. There's a bench outside on the north side of the building. She paused. Don't bring flowers. I have no use for flowers. I wasn't planning to, he said honestly. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but the precursor of one, the ghost of the shape of one. Good, she said. What would you like for lunch? At 2 o'clock he was on the bench. At 2 o'clock exactly, she came out the side door and sat down at the other end of it, keeping a proper distance with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed. You may as well start, she said. I only have 15 minutes. So he started. He told her what he'd told the others, the land, the house, the barn, the well. He told her the distance from town. He told her the work was hard, and the winters were harder, and there was no guarantee of anything except that he would work as hard as she did, and he would not lie to her. Then he stopped. She looked at him. That's all you're offering. That's all I can honestly offer, he said. I'm not a wealthy man. I'm not an easy life. I'm a man with land and a house and enough character I hope to be worth something to a person who needed what I'm describing. The silence stretched. A wagon went by on the main street. A dog barked somewhere. You haven't asked me anything about myself, she said at last. No, he said. I figured that was for you to decide whether to share. Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was quieter, more careful, the way a person talks when they're deciding how much of the truth to hand over. I'm not from here, she said. I came from a town 3 days east of here. I left under circumstances that were not entirely of my choosing. He waited. Didn't ask. Just waited. She looked at him sideways, and what she saw seemed to satisfy something she was measuring. There were accusations, she said. Made by family. False accusations. But in a small town, the difference between false accusations and true ones is often just which person people already liked better. She said it without self-pity, as a statement of plain fact. I left because staying wasn't survivable. I've been here 8 months. I'm safe here. Mrs. Reed is a fair woman. But, Xavier said quietly. She turned to look at him fully for the first time. But Fort Smith isn't mine, she said. It's just the place I landed, and I've been waiting 8 months to understand what the next place is. Xavier said, the next place might be 40 miles west of here on 160 acres of Arkansas frontier land. It's not comfortable, and it's not easy, but it's real, and it's far enough from wherever came before that most people would have trouble following. The silence that fell between them this time was different from the earlier silences. It was a working silence, the kind where something is actually being calculated. I want to be clear about something, Olivia said, and her voice was very steady. I am not looking for rescue. I don't need to be saved. What I need is a situation in which I am treated as a capable adult with her own history and her own mind. That's what I'm offering, Xavier said. Men often say that. I do, he said. I can't prove it to you in a 15-minute conversation on a bench. All I can tell you is that I built that house thinking about what it would need to actually function as a home. And I built 2 bedrooms and a kitchen with a window over the basin and a porch wide enough for 2 chairs. And I have spent 3 months alone in it, and I know exactly how empty it is, and I'm not looking for someone to fill it up. I'm looking for someone to build something in it. He hadn't planned to say all of that. It came out of him without arrangement, and he felt the rawness of it after the way you feel after you've said something true, that you hadn't meant to say quite that directly. Olivia was looking at the street. Then she looked back at him. Her expression was not soft exactly, but it was open in a way it hadn't been before. I need to think, she said. Of course. I need until tomorrow morning. I'll be at the boarding house, he said. Come whenever you're ready, or send word through Mrs. Reed. She stood up and smoothed her apron and looked at him one more time. Mr. Zimmerman, she said, what you described that house, the window over the basin, the porch with 2 chairs. She paused. Nobody builds something like that by accident. Then she went back inside. Xavier sat on the bench for another few minutes without moving. The afternoon was warm, and the street was busy, and somewhere a hammer rang against an anvil, and he thought a house is not enough. A home needs a heart that chooses it. And he did not know yet whether that heart was hers. But he thought, and it was barely a thought, more like a thing felt in the chest rather than worked out in the mind that it might be. He barely slept that night. He lay on the cot in the boarding house listening to the sounds of the town settle into the dark, and he ran the conversation back and forth in his mind, the way you work a splinter, not quite able to leave it alone, not quite able to resolve it. She was careful. She had been hurt. She was proud in the right way, the way that comes from surviving something. And she had told him the shape of her trouble without telling him all of it, which was the right instinct. A person who told a stranger everything on the first conversation had lost their compass. A person who told a stranger nothing was hiding in a way that would come out later and badly. She had told him just enough. That was a kind of intelligence. He thought about what Molly Reed had said. Look at her like she's a person who might help you solve it. He'd tried. He thought he'd succeeded. He didn't know for certain. At some point, he fell into a thin sleep and woke before dawn to the sound of horses on the street below. He dressed and went down to the small dining room and drank bad coffee and waited. At 8 o'clock, Molly Reed appeared at the boarding house door. She was still wearing her apron, which meant she'd walked over from the restaurant in the middle of the morning rush. That meant something. She came to his table, sat down across from him, without being invited, and said, Olivia Norton would like to know one thing before she gives you her answer. Xavier set down his cup. What thing? Molly looked at him steadily. She wants to know if you understand that she may never be fully comfortable telling you all of what happened to her. And she wants to know if that not knowing the whole story would be a problem for you. The question landed on him with more weight than he'd expected. He thought about it honestly. Not the answer that sounded right, but the actual answer worked out in real terms. Did it bother him, not knowing yes somewhat? Was it a problem? He looked at that question squarely. A man who demanded to know everything about a person before he trusted them wasn't really trusting them at all. He was just demanding a down payment on something that could only ever be proved by time. No, he said. It's not a problem. What happened to her before is hers. What we build together from here is ours. Molly studied him for a long moment. Then she stood up, straightened her apron, and said, She'll be at the church at 10 o'clock. The reverends agreed to do it today if both parties are willing. Xavier went very still. Today? She doesn't want a long courtship, Molly said, not unkindly. A long courtship means more time for Harold to find her. Harold. The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. Xavier didn't ask who Harold was, not yet. But the name settled into him cold and specific, and he understood that Olivia Norton's past was not entirely behind her. It was somewhere east of Fort Smith, and it had a name, and eventually, maybe not today, maybe not for months, It was going to have to be dealt with. "I'll be there at 10, Xavier said. Molly nodded once and walked back out into the morning. Xavier sat alone at the table with his cooling coffee and a decision that had already been made before he'd even known he was making it, somewhere between a porch railing in September and a bench conversation in the Fort Smith afternoon, and thought about a woman with quiet eyes and a past she carried like something heavy that she refused to put down. He thought whoever this Harold is, he's going to find that she's not alone anymore. And he finished his coffee and he went to find a clean shirt and he got ready to be married. The church was cold at 10 o'clock in the morning, the way small churches always are when they haven't been heated for a service. A deep, still cold that sits in the wood and the stone and doesn't move for anyone. Xavier arrived 7 minutes early and stood near the front pew with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, the way a man does when his hands need something to do and his mind is going too fast to let them rest. Reverend Aldrich was already there, standing at the front with a Bible and an expression of careful neutrality, the face of a man who had performed enough frontier marriages to know that most of them began in necessity and survived or didn't based on things that had nothing to do with ceremony. "You're sure about this?" the Reverend said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm sure," Xavier said. "You've known this woman less than 2 days." "I know," Xavier said. "I also know I've been building toward this for 3 months, and she's been surviving toward it for longer than that. Sometimes the time you've spent getting somewhere counts more than the time you've known someone." Aldrich regarded him for a moment. "That's either very wise or very foolish." "Probably some of both," Xavier said. The door opened at exactly 10 o'clock. Olivia Norton walked in alone. No family, no friends at her side, just herself in a dark blue dress that was clean and pressed but not new, with her hair pinned back neatly and her chin level. She walked down the short aisle the way she moved through the restaurant, efficiently, quietly, without asking for anyone's attention. She stopped beside Xavier and looked at him directly. "You're still here," she said. "I said I would be." Something in her shoulders released, barely perceptible, but he caught it. A tension she'd been carrying since yesterday afternoon, maybe since long before yesterday, going out of her like a slow breath. "All right," she said, and then turning to the Reverend, "Let's proceed." The ceremony was short. The Reverend kept it plain and honest. The words about commitment and difficulty and choosing to stay, which were the words that mattered, and which most people didn't listen to carefully enough. Xavier listened to everyone. He watched Olivia's face while the Reverend spoke and saw that she was listening too, with the focused attention of someone who understood that words had consequences. When the Reverend asked if he took this woman, Xavier said, "I do," and meant it in the simplest possible way, not romantically, not with illusions, but with the same settled intention with which he'd driven the first nail into the first board of the house that was now waiting 40 miles west. When the Reverend asked Olivia, she was quiet for one beat, one single heartbeat of silence, and then she said, "I do," and her voice was steady and clear and did not waver. There were no rings. They hadn't discussed rings, and neither of them brought it up. The Reverend pronounced them married, shook Xavier's hand, took Olivia's hand briefly in both of his, and said to her very quietly, "God keep you, child." It was the only moment in the ceremony that approached anything like tenderness, and Olivia received it with a small, tight nod and looked away before anything in her face could betray itself. Molly Reed was waiting outside the church door. She had brought a small parcel wrapped in cloth food for the road. It turned out, when Olivia unwrapped it later, cornbread and salt pork and 2 apples and a jar of pickled beets. Molly hugged Olivia with the fierce, brief grip of a woman who does not make a habit of sentiment, and therefore means it absolutely when she does. "You write to me," Molly said, "when you get settled." "I will," Olivia said. Molly looked at Xavier over Olivia's shoulder with an expression that communicated without any ambiguity whatsoever that she would hold him personally responsible for this woman's well-being. Xavier gave her a single nod that he hoped communicated he understood and accepted that responsibility. Then Molly went back to her restaurant, and Xavier and Olivia stood on the church steps in the September morning air, legally married, essentially strangers about to ride 40 miles into a frontier life together. I have a bag at the boarding, Olivia said. One bag. It won't take long. I'll bring Drum around, Xavier said. Do you ride? I can, she said. I'm not elegant about it. That's fine. Drum's not elegant either. It was the first thing that had passed between them that came close to lightness, and they both felt it a small unexpected ease, like finding solid ground in the middle of a crossing. They left Fort Smith before noon. Olivia rode behind Xavier on Drum, her bag tied to the saddle, one hand on the horse's flank, and the other holding herself with careful balance. They didn't talk much in the first hour. The road was rough, and the rhythm of the horse made conversation require effort. And there was enough in both of their minds already without adding words to it. It was Xavier who broke the silence first about 2 hours out, when the town was well behind them, and the land had opened up into the wide, flat quiet of the Arkansas frontier. You can ask me things, he said. If you want to know something about where we're going, or about me, or about how any of this is going to work, you don't have to figure it out alone. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Then, the second bedroom. What about it? Is it finished? It has walls and a floor and a window, he said. No furniture yet. I was going to build a bed frame when I got back. I can sleep on the floor until it's done, she said. I've done worse. The way she said it completely matter-of-fact, with no invitation for sympathy, told him more about her history than anything she'd said directly. He filed it away without commenting on it. I'll build the frame first thing, he said instead. Before anything else, another silence. Then Olivia said, Tell me about the land. So he told her. He told her about the 160 acres where the creek ran, where the soil was deepest, where the grass grew back fastest after grazing. He told her about the barn, and the 3 horses, and the dozen chickens, and the 2 pigs he'd started with. He told her what he planned to plant in the spring, and what he'd already tried and failed at, and what he'd learned from the failure. He talked the way he worked without waste, without performance, just the plain account of a thing. And she listened the way she'd listened on the bench with a focused, considering attention that he was beginning to recognize as one of her fundamental qualities. You know a lot about land, she said. My father's land in Missouri, he said. Spent my whole childhood on it. When he died, my older brother got it. That's the law. So I came west and started my own. How old were you? 22. And you've been building for 4 years. In one way or another, he said. The house is the newest thing. Everything else took time to get right. She was quiet again. Then, my father's land went to debt collectors, she said. After my parents died, I was 16. My cousin Harold and his family took me in. A pause. Which I've spent the last 8 years understanding was the worst thing that could have happened to me, and also the only option I had. He didn't say anything. He let the silence hold the space open. Harold is not a violent man, she said with a precision that suggested she'd thought about how to say this. He's worse than a violent man in some ways. He's a calculating one. Everything he does has a purpose, and the purpose is always what's best for Harold. She paused again. When I was 23, he accused me of stealing from the household accounts. I hadn't. I knew where every cent in those accounts went because I was the one who kept them. But Harold had already told half the town before he told me, and by the time I understood what was happening, it was finished. Xavier felt something cold and specific move through him. Not anger exactly, something more controlled than anger. Something that filed information away for later use. Why? He asked. What did he gain from it? He gained my silence, she said. He'd been taking money from those accounts for 2 years before I figured it out. Once he accused me, I couldn't accuse him. Anything I said looked like defensiveness, like trying to shift blame. Her voice was even, but with a tension underneath it like a wire pulled tight. He's clever. He knew exactly how it would land. And now? Xavier asked. Is he still looking? The silence before her answer was just a beat too long. I don't know, she said. I hope not. I was careful about where I went. I didn't tell anyone in my old town where I was headed. A pause. But Harold has connections, and Harold doesn't like loose ends. The name sat between them heavy and specific. Harold. Xavier had been turning it over since Molly had said it that morning. It had a shape now, a character-calculating patient, the kind of threat that didn't announce itself. If he comes, Xavier said, he comes to my land, my rules, and I am not a man who can be managed by someone else's cleverness. Olivia didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter than it had been. You say that very calmly. I mean it calmly, he said. I'm not trying to frighten you or impress you. I'm just telling you what's true. She didn't answer. But her hand, which had been resting on the saddle, moved slightly. The smallest adjustment, almost nothing, and he felt her weight settle differently behind him. Not relaxing exactly, but grounding. Like someone who has been standing on uncertain footing for a long time and has just found a place to plant their feet. Night. They stopped in the late afternoon to water Drum and rest. Olivia climbed down from the horse with the careful movements of someone whose body was making complaints it was too proud to voice. Xavier didn't offer to help. He'd already learned that she didn't want hands extended to her unless she asked. But he did hand her the water canteen first before he drank himself, and she took it without comment, which he understood as acceptance. They sat on a fallen log near the creek while Drum drank, and Olivia opened Molly's package and divided the food with the same precise fairness she seemed to apply to everything. Exactly half the cornbread, the salt pork split evenly, 1 apple each. You don't have to do it exactly half, Xavier said. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. He understood. Fair was her principle, not just her habit. Fair was what she'd been denied and what she'd decided she would practice, regardless of whether the world practiced it back. They ate in the kind of silence that was starting to feel not comfortable exactly, but workable, like two people figuring out the grammar of each other's company. Can I ask you something? Olivia said. Anything. The two women in Fort Smith, the ones who said no. She kept her eyes on the creek. What was wrong with them? Xavier thought about how to answer that honestly. Nothing was wrong with them, he said. Clara wanted a life near town, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sarah wanted independence she'd already built, and there's nothing wrong with that either. He paused. They knew what they needed, and they were honest about it. I respect both of them. Olivia looked at him sideways. Then why am I here and not one of them? Because what they needed and what I was offering didn't match, he said simply. And what you needed and what I was offering might. Might, she said. Might say. He agreed. I'm not going to tell you I know how this turns out. I don't. I know what I'm willing to do. I know what I've built. The rest is going to be determined by whether two people can figure each other out well enough to build something together. He looked at her steadily. I think we can. But thinking something and knowing it are different things, and I've been around enough hard land to know the difference. She looked at him for a long moment with that measuring quality he was starting to recognize, not suspicion, but assessment. The look of someone who had been given false information too many times and had learned to verify carefully. Then she said, That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 8 years. He didn't know what to do with that, so he did what he usually did. When he didn't know what to do, he picked up the canteen, took a drink, and looked at the creek. We should keep moving, he said. About 12 more miles. Let's go, she said, and stood up and dusted the cornbread crumbs off her dress and looked at the road ahead with the expression of a person who has decided. Bomb. They arrived at the ranch as the last light was pulling out of the sky. Drum knew the way home and picked up his pace in the last half mile, and Xavier felt the horse's eagerness under him, with a kind of relief. Even the animal knew this was right, or at least familiar, which sometimes amounted to the same thing. He heard Olivia's breath change behind him when the shape of the house appeared. She didn't say anything, but her breath changed. He helped her down from the horse. This time she let him, which he filed away as information, and she stood in the yard, looking at the house while he dealt with Drum. He didn't watch her. He gave her the privacy of the moment. When he came back from the barn, she was still standing in the same spot, but something had shifted in her posture, She was looking at the front porch at the two rocking chairs side by side. "You really did build two," she said. "I told you I did." "I know," she said softly. "I just didn't quite believe it until now." He opened the front door and held it, and she walked in ahead of him, and he watched her move through the house in the near dark, touching the kitchen counter, standing at the window above the basin, pausing at the doorway of the second bedroom, where there was, as promised, nothing but walls and floor and a window and bare potential. She stood there for a long time. Long enough that he lit the lamp in the kitchen and started a fire in the stove and put the coffee on, and she still hadn't moved. Finally she said from the doorway of the empty room, "It's not empty." Her voice was very quiet. "It's waiting." Xavier stood at the stove and let those words settle into the house the way warmth settles in slowly from the center out. "That's what I thought," he said. "When I built it." She came back to the kitchen then and sat down at the table, and he put a cup of coffee in front of her and sat down across from her, and they looked at each other in the lamplight. Two people at the beginning of something that had no guarantees and no roadmap, and nothing going for it, except that they had both chosen it with their eyes open. "The bed frame," she said. "How long will it take you?" "Tomorrow afternoon if I start right after the morning chores." She nodded. "I'll take the chores list tonight, so I know what to expect in the morning." "I'll write it out," he said. "Don't write it. Tell me. I'll remember." He told her. Every chore in order, with what each one required. She listened without writing anything down, and when he finished, she repeated the whole list back to him in the correct sequence without a single error. He looked at her. "I have a good memory," she said without particular pride. "It's the only thing Harold never managed to take from me." The name landed in the warm kitchen like a draft under a door. Harold. Even here. Even at this table. Xavier picked up his coffee cup and said without drama, "He's going to find out eventually that you're gone from Fort Smith." "Yes." "And when he does, there's a chance he'll try to trace you." "Yes," she said again. The word was steady, but her hands tightened around her cup. "I want you to understand something," Xavier said. He waited until she was looking directly at him. "This is your home now. Whatever Harold thinks happened, whatever accusation he made or plans to make it, has no power here. He has no standing here. This is my land, my deed, my legal right, and you are my wife." He paused. "What happened in your old town is done. What happens from here is something different." Olivia looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Layered, complicated, the look of someone processing something they hadn't expected to feel. "You can't just declare that and make it true," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "Not by declaring it. But I can make it true by backing it up every single time it gets tested." He set his cup down. "And it will get tested. I know that. I'm not pretending otherwise." The fire in the stove crackled. Outside, drums shifted in the barn. The night was settling in fully now, the frontier dark, coming down thick and complete. Olivia looked at her coffee. Then she looked up at him. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "Not the ranch, not the marriage. I understand the practical reasons for those, but this—" She gestured between them at something she couldn't quite name. "Why are you already treating this like it matters?" Xavier thought about that question seriously, the way it deserved. "Because it does matter," he said. "I didn't build that porch for something that doesn't matter." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people absorbing something true. Then Olivia said, "I don't know how to trust yet. I want you to know that. It's not a failing I'm proud of, but it's honest." "I know," Xavier said. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to stay long enough to find out if you can." She considered him for a long moment. Then she said, "That I can do." The first weeks were the hardest and the most revealing. Not hard in the way Xavier had feared, no great conflicts, no breaking points, no moment where the whole experiment fell apart at the seams. Hard in the quieter, more demanding way that two strangers discover each other, in the collision of habits, in the negotiation of space, in the thousand small daily moments that tell you who a person actually is when there's no audience and no performance. What he learned about Olivia Norton in those first weeks could fill a book. She woke before him every morning, always without fail. By the time he came out of his room, she had already made the coffee and started the breakfast and worked through the first 2 items on the chore list with a focused efficiency that made him feel briefly and absurdly like he was the one who needed to catch up. He'd built this ranch. He'd run it alone for months. And yet somehow the presence of another person with energy and intention made the mornings feel like there were twice as many hours in them. She was not chatty. He'd known that from the bench. But there were 2 kinds of silence he discovered. The silence that closes things off, and the silence that simply doesn't require filling. Olivia's silences were the second kind. They worked side by side through the morning chores and communicated what needed communicating without commentary, and he found to his surprise that this suited him perfectly. He was not a man of unnecessary words himself, but she was also not a woman without opinions. The first one surfaced about 5 days in over the kitchen garden. Xavier had sketched out a rough plan for where to put the kitchen garden in the spring, on the south side of the house close to the kitchen door. Olivia looked at his sketch for a long time without speaking. "The south side gets afternoon shade from the barn," she said finally. He started to object, then stopped himself. He walked out and checked. She was right. The barn's shadow crossed the south yard from about 2 in the afternoon until sundown. Not fatal for a garden, but not ideal. "East side," he said. "East side," she agreed. He moved the sketch. She said nothing more about it, and neither did he, but something had shifted, a small adjustment in the balance between them that felt correct, felt like the beginning of an actual partnership rather than a man with a plan and a woman following it. The second opinion came over money. He showed her the accounts at the end of the first week, what he had, what the ranch needed, what he owed, what he projected to earn. He showed her because it was her household too, and because the woman at the dry goods counter had been right. A house was not a home, and a home required both people to understand what was holding it up. Olivia sat with the account book for a long time. Long enough that he got up and brought her more coffee and sat back down and waited. She had a way with numbers that was immediately apparent, not just reading them, but understanding them, turning them over, seeing the connections between them that a less careful eye would miss. "You're spending too much on seed corn," she said. "If you wait 3 more weeks and order in bulk from the mill in Clarksville, instead of the Fort Smith supplier, you save 18%. He blinked. "How do you know the Clarksville price?" "I kept accounts for 8 years, she said evenly. "I know every supplier price in a 100-mile radius. Harold made sure I understood the finances completely." She paused, and something moved across her face, a quick shadow gone fast. "He didn't realize that meant I'd understand his too." The accounts question became a revelation. Within 2 weeks, Olivia had reorganized the ranch's finances with a precision and intelligence that Xavier, good as he was with the land, could not have matched. She found savings he hadn't known existed. She identified 2 suppliers he'd been overpaying. She drafted a simple system for tracking inventory that took him 10 minutes a week to maintain. He told her one evening that she was wasted as a waitress. She looked at him across the table with something in her eyes that was half amused and half something older and heavier. "I know," she said. And then, "Harold knew it too. That's why he worked so hard to make sure no one else would find out." The mention of Harold always changed the temperature of a room slightly. Not because either of them dwelled on it, they didn't by unspoken agreement, but because the name was a reminder that the past had not finished with them yet. That somewhere east there was a man with a grudge and a long memory and the calculating patience to use both. Xavier didn't know when Harold would surface. He only knew that he would. It was Clem Bartlett who brought the first warning. Clem rode over on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week ostensibly to return a borrowed rope coil, but actually as Xavier had long since learned to find out what was happening with his neighbor, which was what Clem did, and which was not as intrusive as it sounded, because Clem was the only neighbor within 2 miles, and his interest was at its core genuine. He pulled up in the yard and looked at the house and the garden sketch stakes and the newly repaired fence line and said, "You've been busy." We have, Xavier said, because we was the correct word now, and it fit easily it hadn't expected. Clem climbed down, tied his horse, and shook Xavier's hand. Then he looked toward the house. Is she? Come in and meet her, Xavier said. Olivia was at the kitchen table with the account book when they came in. She looked up, assessed Clem. In about 4 seconds, Xavier was beginning to clock how fast she read people, and it was very fast, and stood to extend her hand. Olivia Zimmerman, she said. His name came out of her without hesitation, and something about hearing her say it that way that naturally settled into Xavier's chest like a nail going home. Clem shook her hand, with the careful respect of an older man who had lived long enough to recognize capability when it was standing in front of him. Clem Bartlett, neighbor. He sat down when Olivia gestured to the chair and accepted the coffee she put in front of him and said, I came to return the rope, but I also came because I heard something in town last week. Xavier's attention sharpened. What town, Fort Smith? No, smaller. Depot stop about 20 miles east. Clem wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Man came through asking questions. Looking for a woman traveling alone or with a rancher? Dark-haired mid-20s from a town further east. Named Norton. The kitchen went very quiet. Olivia's face did not change. That was the remarkable thing. Not a flinch, not a catch of breath, nothing that someone watching casually would have caught. But Xavier was not watching casually. He saw her hands flat on the table, pressed down just slightly, pressing into the wood, anchoring herself. What kind of man? Xavier said. Well-dressed, polite, introduced himself as family looking for a missing relative. Clem said the word family with a particular flatness that made clear he'd already formed his own opinion of it. Didn't sit right with me, so I asked around after he left. Apparently, he'd been through 2 other stops in the previous week, working his way west. Xavier looked at Olivia. She was looking at the table. Olivia, he said quietly. She looked up. Her eyes were steady, but underneath the steadiness was something controlled and careful and absolutely not panicking, which told him she'd been expecting this and had been managing the expectation for 3 weeks without showing it. Harold doesn't give up, she said. I told you that. You did, Xavier said. This is what he does, she said. He's systematic. He works in a direction. He won't stop until he's found me, or until he believes there's no advantage in continuing. She paused. The only way he believes there's no advantage is if there's nothing he can take from me. And right now, Xavier said. She looked at him with complete directness. Right now I have a home and a name and a legal marriage. Those are things he can't easily unravel. Another pause. But he's going to try. Clem had been listening to this exchange with the patient attention of a man who understood frontier trouble and its many shapes. He set down his coffee cup and said, What do you need from me? Xavier looked at him. Clem Bartlett was 63 years old, had lived on his land for 22 years, and knew every rock and road and human being within 30 miles. He was Xavier had come to understand as valuable a neighbor as a man could have out here. If he comes through your way, Xavier said, I need to know. That I can do, Clem said simply. Olivia said, he'll be charming. He always is. He'll make whatever story he's telling sound completely reasonable. Clem looked at her with something close to dry humor. Mrs. Zimmerman, I've lived on this frontier for 22 years. I've met every kind of charming there is, and I'm not moved by any of it. He stood, put on his hat, and said to Xavier, You've got a good one here. Don't let some eastern schemer come out here and make trouble for what you've built. He left. The yard went quiet again. Xavier and Olivia sat at the kitchen table and looked at each other across the account book and the coffee cups and the thin morning light. He's closer than I thought, she said. She said it quietly without drama, but he heard the thing underneath the quiet. He's still 20 miles east, Xavier said, and he's looking for a woman named Norton traveling alone. He looked at her steadily. He's not looking for a rancher's wife named Zimmerman on 160 acres with a legal marriage record. She absorbed that. He watched her absorb it, the small internal shift of a person recalculating their odds. "That buys time," she said. "It buys time," he agreed. "And time is what we need to make this solid enough that it can't be questioned." "What does solid look like?" Xavier thought about it. "People who've seen you here. Work that shows you've been here. Records. Neighbors who know your name." He paused. "A life that looks like what it is." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said something he hadn't expected. "I'm not afraid of him. I want you to know that. I'm angry at him. Those are different things." "I know," Xavier said. "I ran before because I was alone, and I had nothing to stand behind," she said. "I'm not alone now." The words came out of her simply, without emphasis, the way truth usually does, not announced, just stated. And in the stating of them, something between them settled into a shape that hadn't quite had a shape before. Not romance, not yet. They were too careful for that, both of them, but something solid. Something that would hold weight. Xavier reached across the table and picked up the account book and turned it around to face him. "Show me the Clarksville supplier again," he said. "I want to write the order today." Olivia pulled her chair closer and leaned over the book, and they went back to work, because that was what this was, work, and the willingness to do it, and the choice to do it together. And Harold was east, and getting closer, and the winter was coming, and there was still a bed frame to build, and a garden to plan, and a ranch to run. And neither of them looked away from any of it. The order went out to Clarksville that same afternoon, and by the end of the week, the bed frame was built and Olivia's room had furniture in it for the first time, and the ranch was running the way a ranch runs when two capable people are working it. Instead of one, not twice as well, but 3 times, because the right two people together don't just add to each other, they multiply. October came in hard. The temperature dropped faster than Xavier had expected, faster than his first 2 winters on the land, and the work shifted from building and planting to weatherproofing and storing. They worked from before dawn until after dark every day, and the days were shorter now, shrinking at both ends, and the cold made every task take longer and demand more. Xavier watched Olivia work in that October and revised every assessment he'd made of her upward. She didn't complain. Not once. Not about the cold, not about the labor, not about the roughness of the life compared to whatever life she'd imagined or whatever life she'd had before. She worked with a focused, unhesitating commitment that reminded him of the way good land absorbs rain completely without wasting any of it. But it was more than the work. It was the quality of her attention. One morning, about 3 weeks into October, she came into the barn where he was checking the horses for the early signs of winter ailments and said without preamble, "The northwest corner of the roof is going to be a problem." He looked at her. "What kind of problem?" "The boards aren't seated right. When the snow comes heavy, the weight is going to sit wrong, and you'll have a leak, maybe worse." She paused. "I noticed it 2 days ago. I didn't say anything because I wanted to make sure I was reading it right." He went and looked. She was right. He'd built that corner in August, when he was working fast and tired, and he'd cut a corner literally on the board seating, and it had looked fine in dry weather and would fail spectacularly in a heavy snow. He fixed it that day. It took 4 hours and cost him other work he'd planned. He fixed it without complaint because she'd caught it, and she'd been right, and that was more valuable than anything else. That evening, when they were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, with the lamp between them, he said, "Thank you, for the roof." She looked up from the account book. "I live under it too." "I know," he said. "But you could have said nothing and waited to see if I caught it myself." She set down her pen and looked at him with a directness that he had come to understand was her default mode. Not aggressive, just honest, the way a person is honest when they've decided that honesty is less expensive than the alternatives. "That's not how I intend to do this," she said. "If I see something, I say it. That's the only way any of this works." Xavier nodded slowly. "Agreed." She picked up her pen again. Then she said without looking up, "You're the same way. I noticed that about you early." He didn't ask what specifically she'd noticed. He had the feeling she'd tell him if and when she felt like it, and pressing would accomplish nothing, close something that was slowly and carefully opening. It was Clem Bartlett who came back with the second warning. Not Tuesday this time, a Friday mid-morning, riding faster than his usual pace. Xavier was splitting wood when he heard the horse and looked up, and something in the way Clem was moving told him before Clem spoke. He set down the axe and waited. Clem pulled up, didn't even dismount. "He was in Boonville yesterday," he said. "That's 12 miles east." He's asking more specific questions now. Not just a dark-haired woman, he's got a description. Height, age, the color of her eyes. He paused. Someone talked. Xavier felt the cold move through him that had nothing to do with October. Who? Don't know. Could be anyone from Fort Smith who saw her. Could be the boarding house. Clem's voice was measured, but his eyes were serious. He's telling people she stole from his family, that she's mentally unstable, that her husband, if she's got one, has been deceived. He met Xavier's eyes directly. He's working ahead of himself, building the story before he arrives. Xavier was very still. "That's clever," he said, and the word came out flat. "It's what a clever man does," Clem agreed. "He gets there last, but his story gets there first." "How much time do we have?" "If he's in Boonville yesterday, he could be here in 2 days. Maybe 3 if the road's bad." Clem looked at the house. "Is she inside?" "Yes." "You should tell her." "I'm going to," Xavier said. Clem turned his horse. "I'll send my boy over if I hear anything more." He started to ride, then stopped. "Xavier, whatever that man says when he gets here, your neighbors know you. They don't know him. That counts for something out here." Then he was gone. Xavier stood in the yard holding the axe and thinking for about 30 seconds. Then he put the axe down and went inside. Olivia was at the table. She looked up when he came in, and his face told her something before he did. She put down her pen. "He's closer," she said. "Boonville. Yesterday." Not a flinch, not a visible one, but her jaw set in a specific way that he'd learned meant she was organizing something internally, putting things in order the way she did, with accounts finding the structure underneath the numbers. "What's he saying?" Xavier told her. "All of it, the description, the story about theft and instability, the preemptive narrative." He told it straight without softening. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's going to try to have me removed." She said it clinically, like a diagnosis. "He'll claim the marriage is fraudulent, that I misrepresented myself to deceive you. He'll try to paint you as a victim so you'll cooperate with him." "I'm not a victim," Xavier said. "I know that. You know that." Her voice was very steady. But a man who arrives with a prepared story in a sympathetic manner can be very convincing to people who don't know the full picture. "Then we make sure people know the full picture," Xavier said. "Before he gets here." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means we go to Clem's tomorrow, and we go to the Patterson place on the south end, and we go to the Reverend's man in the nearest settlement, whoever that is, and we tell our story first." He met her eyes. "You told me what Harold does. He gets there last, but his story gets there first. We get there before either of us." Something moved across her face, surprise maybe, or the thing that happens when someone does something you hoped for but didn't expect. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, "You'd do that." "We'd do that," he said. "Together. That's how this works." She looked down at the table. 1 breath, 2, then she looked back up. "All right," she said. "What do we tell them?" "The truth," Xavier said. "Exactly what happened to you in your own words to people who are going to meet Harold and need to know what they're meeting." "My word against his," she said. "Your word and my word," Xavier said. "And you've been here 6 weeks and he's never been here once. Out here that matters." They rode to Clem's that afternoon. Sitting in Clem's kitchen, a warm, crowded room that smelled of tobacco and dried herbs, and the particular smell of a home that had been lived in for 20 years, Olivia told her story for the first time completely. Not the edited version she'd given Xavier on the road. Not the careful outline she'd offered on the bench in Fort Smith. The whole thing. She talked for 40 minutes without stopping. Clem's wife, Martha, sat across the table with her hands folded and her eyes on Olivia's face the entire time. Martha Bartlett was 61, small, sharp-minded, and had raised 4 children on frontier land through drought and illness and loss. She was not a woman who was easily impressed or easily moved. But by the time Olivia finished, Martha's hands were no longer folded, they were pressed flat on the table in front of her, the way you press down on something to keep it from rising. "He took 8 years from you," Martha said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Olivia said. "And then he stole from his own family and put your name on it." "Yes." Martha looked at her husband. Something passed between them, the wordless communication of 2 people who have been in the same room for 40 years. Then Martha looked back at Olivia and said, "When this Harold arrives, he is going to find that the women in this community have already formed an opinion of him. And we are not a community that changes our opinions easily." Olivia looked at the older woman with something in her face that Xavier had not seen there before. Not gratitude exactly, though it was related to gratitude. It was more like the expression of someone who has been carrying something alone for so long that the feeling of another pair of hands on the weight is almost incomprehensible. "Thank you," Olivia said. The words came out smaller than she intended he could tell, smaller and more raw. Martha reached across the table and covered Olivia's hand with her own. "You're Zimmerman's wife," she said simply. "That means you're ours." They went to the Patterson place the next morning and to 2 other homesteads by afternoon. Each time Olivia told the story cleaner each time, more ordered, the details more precise. Xavier watched her find the shape of it with each telling. Watched her understand that putting it into words for other people was not diminishing it, but containing it, giving it edges so it couldn't keep spreading into every dark corner of her thinking. By the time they rode home that second day, she was quieter than usual, but it was a different quiet from the guarded silence of the early weeks. It was the quiet of someone who had done something effortful and important, and was absorbing what it had cost and what it had given back. Xavier didn't break the quiet. He let it ride with them. About a mile from the ranch, she said without looking at him, "I've never told anyone the whole thing before." "I know," he said. "It's different saying it out loud." A pause. "It's smaller. In my head it was enormous. Saying it out loud makes it actual, real, and finite." Another pause. "He's still terrible, but he's a terrible man who did terrible things, not a force of nature." "He's a man with a story that doesn't hold up," Xavier said. "And now the people around us know that." She nodded. And then she said something he hadn't expected. "I'm glad I married you." The words came out quietly, and without drama, and he thought she might not have meant to say them quite that directly. There was a flash of something across her face, afterward, a small self-surprise. But she didn't take them back. He said, "I'm glad too." And they rode the rest of the way home in the particular silence of 2 people who have said something true and don't need to say anything else for a while. Harold Norris arrived on a Wednesday. Xavier saw him from the fence line where he was working the morning repair on the east pasture. A man on a rented horse, well dressed for the frontier, moving up the road toward the ranch with the unhurried confidence of someone who had decided how a conversation was going to go before it started. Xavier had seen that walk before. Not on Harold specifically, but on the type. The kind of man who prepared the terrain before he entered it and expected the preparation to do most of his work. He set down his fencing tools and walked toward the house, not running, not hurrying, just walking with purpose, getting between Harold and the front door before Harold got there first. He arrived at the yard gate at the same moment Harold pulled up his horse. Harold Norris was perhaps 35, lean and fair-haired, with the kind of face that had been arranged by practice into an expression of reasonable concern. His clothes were good. His manner was open and direct. He dismounted and extended his hand immediately. "Good morning. I'm looking for the Zimmerman property." "You found it," Xavier said. He did not shake the hand. Harold's expression adjusted almost imperceptibly, recalibrating, filing away the information that the handshake had been declined. I'm Harold Norris. I believe you may have recently married a woman I know. Olivia Norton. I've been looking for her. The family has been very worried. Have they? Xavier said. She left under difficult circumstances. Harold said, his voice carrying just the right weight of familial concern. There were some misunderstandings, financial matters that I'm afraid were never properly resolved. We simply want to make sure she's all right and to have the opportunity to clear the air. Xavier looked at him. He let the look sit for long enough that Harold had to work not to fill the silence. Mr. Norris, Xavier said at last, I know who you are. I know what happened 8 years ago, and I know what happened 2 years ago with the household accounts. Something shifted in Harold's eyes. Not guilt. Men like Harold did not feel guilt in the way it usually presented. Something more like recalculation, a rapid adjustment to a landscape that wasn't what he'd mapped. I don't know what she's told you, he said carefully, but Olivia has struggled with the truth in ways that— She's told me everything, Xavier said. And so have the people around here who've known me for years. They know me, Mr. Norris. They don't know you. Out here, that's the whole game. Harold's pleasantness didn't crack, but it cooled slightly, becoming less warm and more deliberate. I have documentation, he said. Records of the missing funds. I have statements from people in our hometown who— You can take your documentation to the county courthouse in Fort Smith, Xavier said. They have records there too. A marriage record, a land deed, 6 weeks of my wife living and working on this property as a legal resident of Arkansas, witnessed by every neighbor I have. He took one step forward, not aggressive, just closing the distance enough that Harold had to look up slightly. And I can tell you right now what you'll find when you take your documentation there. A judge who's going to want to know why a man has been traveling west for 3 weeks, pursuing a woman who is legally married, lawfully settled, and by the account of every person in this community, who's met her, one of the most honest people they've encountered. Harold was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to the house. Is she here? She is. I'd like to speak with her. I know you would, Xavier said. She doesn't want to speak with you. That's for her to say. She said it, Xavier said. Last night, when she knew you were coming, she said, if he asks to speak to me, tell him I have nothing to say to him that I haven't already said to the people who matter. He paused. Those are her exact words. You're welcome to wait in the yard while I get her to confirm them if you'd like. Harold Norris looked at Xavier Zimmerman for a long moment. It was the look of a man who is very good at what he does, confronting the fact that what he does has failed. The reasonable concern on his face didn't disappear. It was too well practiced for that. But behind it, something was moving, calculating, figuring out if there was another angle, another approach, another lever. Xavier held his gaze and gave him nothing. Then the door of the house opened. Olivia came out. She walked across the yard and stood beside Xavier, not behind him, not to the side. Beside him, her shoulder aligned with his, facing Harold directly. Harold looked at her, and whatever he'd been calculating died in his face, because what he saw was not what he'd expected to see. He'd expected Xavier guessed someone frightened, someone defensive, someone whose posture told him she was still running. Olivia was not running. She was standing still on her own land next to her husband, with her chin level and her eyes open, and absolutely nothing in her face that looked like guilt. Harold, she said. Olivia. His voice had changed, more controlled now, the pleasantness stripped back to something more precise. You look well. I am well, she said. We've been concerned. I know you have, she said. I imagine it's very inconvenient that I left before you could control what I said next. She said it without venom, just plainly the way she said everything, with the particular power of a woman who has decided that the truth is the only weapon she needs. I'm not coming back, Harold. I'm not going to any courthouse with you. I'm not going to negotiate or discuss or correspond. She paused. I live here now. I'm Olivia Zimmerman. Whatever story you've been telling people between here and our hometown, you can keep telling it. The people here know the other one. Harold looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. "You've been talking," he said. There was something in the way he said it, not an accusation exactly, more like a man who has just discovered that the fire he set has burned past the line he drew. "Yes," she said. "I have, to everyone within 20 miles. Another silence. Harold's horse shifted behind him. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called. Then Harold said very quietly, and with a precision that made it feel less like a concession and more like a temporary tactical withdrawal, "This isn't finished." "For you, maybe not," Olivia said. "For me, it finished 8 years ago. You just didn't know it yet." Harold looked at Xavier one more time. Xavier said nothing. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't say better. Harold Norris remounted his horse. He straightened his jacket. He rode back down the road the way he'd come, unhurried, deliberate, with the composure of a man who never lets anyone see him rattled. They watched him go. When he was far enough down the road that he was becoming a shape rather than a person, Xavier said, "He's going to think about whether there's another move. Let him think," Olivia said. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the work it was taking. The controlled exhalation of someone who has been braced for impact and is now absorbing the aftermath. "He's good at thinking. He's less good when the thinking doesn't give him anywhere to go." "You were right about him," Xavier said. "Everything you told me." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've spent 8 years understanding exactly who he is. I know every move before he makes it." She looked at the empty road. What I didn't know was what it would feel like to have somewhere to stand when he came. She didn't look at Xavier when she said it. She kept her eyes on the road where Harold had been. But her shoulder aligned with his, pressed slightly inward, the smallest possible gesture, barely more than a shift in weight. And he felt it, and he understood what it meant, and he didn't say anything, because some things don't need words and are diminished by them. Harold did not come back that week. Clem sent word on the Friday that Harold had asked around in the nearest settlement, encountered nothing but closed doors and unwilling faces, and ridden back east. Not because he had given up. Nobody believed he'd given up, but because the ground here wasn't soft enough for the approach he'd prepared. Martha Bartlett came over the following Sunday with 2 of the other women from neighboring homesteads, a quiet, deliberate visit that had been arranged without anyone explicitly arranging it, the way women in frontier communities organize themselves when something needed organizing. They brought food, and they stayed for 3 hours, and they talked about everything except Harold, which was its own statement. When they left, Olivia stood at the door and watched them ride away, and Xavier, coming out of the barn, found her standing there with an expression on her face he hadn't seen before. "What?" he said. She turned to look at him. "I've never had that before," she said. "People who just show up, because something happened and you're part of their community, and that's what the community does." He didn't know what to say to that. So he said, "You have it now." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and went back inside, and he heard the sound of her starting the stove for supper, and he stood in the yard for a moment, just listening to the particular sound of a house that was not empty, the sounds of another person's presence, steady and real and chosen. The first real test of the ranch came in November. Not Harold, nature. The storm arrived without much warning, a hard, fast-moving front that dropped the temperature 20 degrees in 6 hours and pushed a foot of snow across the land in a single overnight. Xavier woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of the wind and knew immediately that something was wrong. He was already pulling on his boots when Olivia appeared in the doorway of her room fully dressed. "The chickens," she said, "and the horses, and the south fence might not hold." He was moving before he finished the sentence. She was right behind him. What followed was 4 hours of the hardest physical work Xavier had done since building the house, and he had not done it alone. They worked in the dark and the wind and the biting cold, moving animals, shoring up the fence, covering what needed covering, making the decisions that had to be made fast and often with incomplete information. He didn't give instructions, and she didn't ask for them. They read the situation together and responded to it together, and when one of them saw something the other had missed, they said so, and the other one acted without argument. At around 7 in the morning, they came back inside with all the animals accounted for and the fence held and 3 chickens that would have died if they'd waited another hour safely in the barn. Olivia sat down at the kitchen table. She was soaked and exhausted, and her hands were shaking slightly from the cold. Xavier built the fire up and put the coffee on and pulled her chair closer to the stove and said, "Put your hands here." She put her hands near the warmth and said, "We didn't lose anything." "No," he said, "we didn't." She looked up at him. She was red-faced from the cold, and her hair had come loose from its pins, and she looked in that moment less like the careful, controlled woman who had sat across from him on a bench in Fort Smith, and more like someone who had been through something real and come out the other side of it. "We work well together," she said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like a conclusion reached after sufficient evidence. "Yes," he said simply. "We do." She looked at her hands near the fire. And then she said very quietly, something she hadn't said before and hadn't been ready to say before. "I think I'm going to be all right here." Xavier poured the coffee, set her cup in front of her, sat down across the table. "I think you are too," he said. She wrapped both hands around the cup, and the fire crackled, and outside the storm kept moving east, carrying whatever it was carrying away from them, and the house was warm, and it was not empty, and it had not been empty for a long time now, and both of them knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. Because some things built slowly out of hard work and honest words and the willingness to stay don't need to be announced. They simply become true. The winter that followed the November storm was the kind that tests everything. The structures a man builds, the plans he makes, and most of all the people he builds them with. It did not break them. It did something better. It showed them what they were made of individually and together in the way that only sustained difficulty can, not in the dramatic crisis moments, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary hard days, one after another, each one requiring something and giving something back in a currency that wasn't money or comfort, but understanding. December was brutal. January was worse. The cold came in off the northern plains and sat on the land like something with intention, and Xavier and Olivia moved through it the way they'd moved through everything since the November storm together, efficiently, without wasted motion or wasted words. The chores took twice as long in the cold. The animals needed more tending. The firewood they'd stacked in October ran low by mid-January, and Xavier spent 3 days cutting more, while Olivia managed everything else. And when he came in on the third evening with his hands bleeding through his gloves, she said nothing, just took his hands and put them in warm water and held them there until the feeling came back, and the silence between them in that moment was not the silence of strangers or the silence of obligation, but the silence of two people who had stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. That was when he knew something had changed. He couldn't have named the exact day it happened. It didn't happen on a day it happened the way a season changes gradually, and then completely, the way you don't notice the cold leaving until one morning the air has a different quality, and you realize spring has already begun. He was falling in love with his wife. He didn't say it. The timing wasn't right, and the words didn't feel adequate to the thing, and he was a man who had learned from land and weather, and the kind of work that doesn't forgive carelessness, that the right action at the wrong moment was still the wrong action. So he held it, and he worked alongside her, and he let the days accumulate, and he trusted that whatever was growing between them was growing in both directions. He thought it was. He was fairly certain it was. But Olivia Zimmerman was not a woman who revealed herself easily, and he respected that too much to push against it. It was Martha Bartlett who pushed against it for him without intending to. In early February, Martha came over with a jar of preserves, and the kind of casual purpose that meant she actually had something specific to say. She sat at the kitchen table while Olivia made tea, and she talked about her grandchildren and the condition of the road and the price of flour at the settlement store, and Xavier, who understood Clem's wife well enough by now to know that this preamble meant something was coming, waited. It came when Olivia went to the pantry for the sugar. Martha leaned across the table and said to Xavier very quietly and very directly, "That woman is in love with you, and she doesn't know what to do about it." Xavier went still. I'm not telling you this so you'll do something foolish, Martha said. I'm telling you because she spent 8 years in a situation where what she felt was used against her. She doesn't know how to feel something without being afraid of it. She straightened up as Olivia's footsteps came back. Just be patient and be clear. She needs to know it's safe. Then Olivia came back with the sugar and Martha seamlessly resumed talking about flour prices, and Xavier sat at the table with his coffee and the weight of what Martha had said and thought about a woman who had been carrying something she didn't know how to put down. That night after supper, they were at the table in their usual positions, the account book open, the lamp between them. The fire in the stove making the kitchen warm and close when Xavier said without planning it, "Can I ask you something?" Olivia looked up. "Yes." "Are you happy here?" She was quiet for a moment. Not a calculating quiet, a genuine one. The kind where a person is actually taking the question seriously instead of reaching for the convenient answer. "Happy is a complicated word," she said finally. "Then use your own word." She looked at him. And then she said something he didn't expect. "Safe. I feel safe here. I haven't felt that in 8 years." A pause. "And there's something else. Something that took me a while to identify because I haven't felt it in a long time either." She stopped. "What?" he said. Her eyes went to the lamp. "Seen," she said quietly. "I feel seen here. Not managed. Not assessed for usefulness. Not watched for mistakes." She looked back at him. "You see me. And what you see doesn't seem to disappoint you." The words came out of her carefully and precisely, like something she'd worked out exactly how to say, and beneath the precision was something fragile and honest that cost her to put into the room. Xavier looked at her across the lamp. "It doesn't disappoint me," he said. "Not even slightly. Not even once." The silence that followed was the most charged one they had ever shared. Not uncomfortable, but full, the way a room is full before something is said that changes the shape of it. Then Olivia looked down at the account book and said with a steadiness that he understood was not coldness, but self-protection, "We're over budget on the winter feed by 4%. We should adjust the spring order." He let her redirect it. He understood why she needed to. He said, "Show me," and they spent the next hour on the accounts, and when they went to their separate rooms, he didn't say anything more, but he carried what she'd said, with him seen and understood, that this was a woman who had been invisible for 8 years, made invisible by someone who needed her competence and feared her clarity, and that being seen by someone who wasn't afraid of what he saw was for her more intimate than anything else could be. He was going to deserve that. He decided it then plainly and without drama, the way he decided things that mattered. He was going to keep deserving it every day. February brought the second crisis, and this one arrived from a direction neither of them had anticipated. It started with a letter. Clem brought it over himself on a Thursday, which was unusual. Mail didn't come to the Bartlett place often, and when it did, Clem sent his boy with it, not himself. The fact that Clem came personally told Xavier before he saw the letter that something was wrong. The envelope was addressed to Olivia Zimmerman, care of the Bartlett property. It had a Fort Smith postmark. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful feminine, nothing like Harold's educated script. Olivia opened it at the kitchen table with Xavier and Clem present, because she said simply, "You should both hear this." The letter was from a woman named Ruth Calloway. She identified herself as a distant cousin on Olivia's mother's side, not Harold's branch of the family, the other one, the one that had gone quiet after Olivia's parents died and hadn't been heard from since. Ruth had tracked Olivia through the Fort Smith marriage record and written to say 2 things. The first thing was that she was sorry. She'd heard what Harold had done. She'd heard it at the time and had been afraid to speak and had regretted the cowardice ever since. The second thing was this: Harold was not coming back alone. Olivia's hand tightened on the letter, and Xavier watched her read the next paragraph twice before she read it aloud. "Harold has retained a lawyer," she read. Her voice was controlled. "He intends to file a claim in Sebastian County Court contesting your marriage on grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. He has found a man, I do not know his name, who is willing to sign a statement claiming he witnessed you steal from Harold's household and confess to it in his presence. This statement does not exist and never happened, but Harold has found a way to manufacture. He intends to file within the month. Ruth. The kitchen was very quiet. Clem said, "A manufactured witness." "Yes," Xavier said. His voice was level. Inside, something had gone cold and precise and very focused. Olivia set the letter down on the table. She pressed her hands flat on either side of it, a gesture he recognized now, the grounding gesture, the one she used when she needed something solid under her. "He's escalating," she said. "Because the direct approach didn't work, he's going to the courts." "Can he win?" Clem said. A fraudulent statement from a paid witness against a woman with no local connections in her original town and no resources to fight it, Olivia said, with the terrible clarity of someone who understands a legal system that wasn't built for people like her. If this were her word against a manufactured document... She stopped. "Possibly." Xavier stood up. "Then we don't let it be her word against a document." Both of them looked at him. "We get ahead of it," he said. "The same way we got ahead of Harold's story with the neighbors. We go to Fort Smith. We go to the courthouse first. We file our own statement, both of us under oath, and we bring every piece of documentation we have. The marriage record, the land deed, the account records that show Olivia's been running this ranch's finances for 5 months." He looked at Clem. "And we bring witnesses." Clem didn't hesitate. "I'll come. Martha too, if she's willing." "She's willing," Clem said. "She'll be more than willing. She'll be enthusiastic." Xavier looked at Olivia. She was looking at him with an expression that was complicated and layered, the look of a woman calculating odds and finding them better than she'd expected and not quite knowing how to receive that. "It's a 2-day ride," she said. "In February." "I know. And there's no guarantee the judge... There's no guarantee of anything," he said. "But a man who files a fraudulent document against a woman in her absence is betting she'll be absent. We show up and the whole bet fails." He held her eyes. "Harold wins when you're alone and running. He doesn't know what to do when you're not." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Clem. Then she looked back at Xavier, and something in her face settled, not the controlled settling of self-discipline, but the real settling, the kind that comes from actually deciding, from actually choosing. "When do we leave?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," Xavier said. "Before light." They rode to Fort Smith in 2 days through February. Cold that was unpleasant enough to be memorable and not quite severe enough to be dangerous, which Xavier was quietly grateful for. Clem and Martha rode with them. Martha bundled in every layer she owned, complaining about the cold, with a cheerfulness that made the whole thing feel improbably like less of a catastrophe. They arrived in Fort Smith on the evening of the second day, stiff and cold and purposeful. Molly Reed took them in. She didn't ask questions Olivia had written ahead. She just opened the back rooms of the restaurant and put food on the table and coffee in their hands. And when Xavier tried to explain the situation, she said, "I know what the situation is. Olivia wrote me. What do you need?" Anyone in this town who knew Olivia during her 8 months here and would sign a statement about her character, Xavier said. Molly looked at him with an expression that managed to combine respect with mild impatience. "Xavier Zimmerman," she said. "This woman worked for me for 8 months. I know everything about her character. And I know every business person and church-going family in this town. And I'm going to spend tonight making visits, and tomorrow morning you're going to have more character witnesses than you can fit in a courtroom." She picked up her coat from the hook. "Now eat your supper." She was not wrong. The next morning, they went to the county courthouse with Molly Reed, Reverend Aldrich, the woman from the general store who'd given Xavier advice on his first day in town, 2 families from the church congregation who had known Olivia by sight and reputation, and Clem and Martha Bartlett, who had driven 2 days in February cold and were prepared to be as difficult as necessary. The county clerk, a precise man named Simmons, who had the air of someone who had processed enough frontier legal disputes to be genuinely unsurprisable. listened to Xavier's account of the situation, and looked at the stack of documentation marriage record. Land deed 5 months of financial accounts in Olivia's hand. A letter from Ruth Calloway describing Harold's stated intention to file a fraudulent claim, and said, "And you're here to file a preemptive statement." "We're here to file a preemptive statement," Xavier confirmed. "Under oath, both of us, and with witnesses prepared to file supporting affidavits." Simmons looked at the group of people standing in his office, which was not large enough for all of them, and had become somewhat crowded. He looked at Martha Bartlett specifically, who was looking back at him with the expression of a woman who had driven 2 days in February and was not going home without accomplishing what she'd come for. "This is irregular," Simmons said. "My understanding," Xavier said, "is that a fraudulent legal claim is also irregular." Simmons looked at him. "Sit down, Mr. Zimmerman." They sat. They filed the statements. All of them, Xavier, Olivia, Clem, Martha, Molly, Reverend Aldrich. 6 sworn affidavits filed before Harold's lawyer had shown up with anything at all. When they were done, Simmons looked at the stack of documents and said to no one in particular, "If and when a claim is filed against this marriage, the court is going to find a rather substantial record already in place." "That's the intention," Olivia said. Simmons looked at her for a moment. "You kept the accounts for 8 years." "Yes." "For the Norris household." "Yes." He tapped the folder of affidavits. "If you have any of those records, the originals from those 8 years, they'd be useful to have in evidence." Olivia was very still. "I took copies," she said slowly, "when I left. I took copies of 3 years of accounts, because I knew that someday I might need to prove what I knew." She paused. "They're in my room at the ranch." Simmons looked at her over his glasses. "Those copies filed here would make a fraudulent claim essentially impossible to sustain." He said it mildly with professional neutrality. "Just so you're aware of your options." Xavier looked at Olivia. She was looking at Simmons, with the expression of someone who has been holding a card for 3 years and has just been told the game calls for exactly that card. "I'll file them," she said. "I'll send them within the week." They rode back to the ranch with the particular exhaustion of people who have done something difficult and done it right, which is a different exhaustion from failure, heavier in the body, lighter in the mind. On the second evening of the return ride, they camped near a creek, and Clem and Martha fell asleep almost immediately, which left Xavier and Olivia sitting at the small fire in the late winter dark, and for a while, neither of them said anything. Then Olivia said, "The copies." "Tell me," Xavier said. "When I left, I took 3 years of account books. Not originals copies I'd made myself because I kept copies as a habit, because I never trusted that the originals were safe." She looked at the fire. "I've been carrying them in the lining of my bag since I left. They've been in my room since September." A pause. "I never told you because I didn't know if I'd need them. I didn't know if it was over." "It's not a secret you needed to tell me," he said. "It was yours to hold until you needed it." She looked at him. "It's evidence that proves not just that I'm innocent, but that he's guilty. That he stole from his own household. That he's been doing it for years." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. They had the brightness of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just begun to understand that they might be able to put it down. When those records are filed, Harold is not just going to lose his case. He's going to have a problem of his own. Xavier thought about Harold on the road on his rented horse with his prepared story and his reasonable manner. He thought about a man who had taken 8 years from a woman who had done nothing but keep his accounts with absolute honesty and then burned her to cover what he was doing with them. "Good," Xavier said. It was the only word he had that fit. Olivia looked at the fire for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I'm done running." "You've been done since September," he said. "You just didn't know it yet." She looked at him. And this time, what was in her eyes was not controlled or calculated or measured. It was direct, fully, completely direct, and it was warm, and it was certain, and it was the look of a woman who has decided something important and is not afraid of the decision. "Xavier," she said. "Yes. I am going to say something, and I need you to not say anything. Not yet. Just let me say it." He nodded. "I came to Fort Smith with nothing," she said. "I had $8 saved, one bag, and a name that felt borrowed because my own had been damaged. I was surviving, that's all. Just surviving." She stopped, took one breath. "I am not just surviving anymore. I'm living. Actually, living. And it's because of this." She moved her hand between them, the same gesture she'd made the first night at the kitchen table, the one indicating something she couldn't name. "Because of what we've built. And I need you to know that I don't take it lightly. I don't take you lightly. And I am not afraid of it anymore." Xavier held his silence exactly as long as she'd asked him to. He let the words sit in the cold air and become real. Then he said, "I love you. I know it's probably too soon, and I know you don't need to say anything back." "It's not too soon," she said, quiet and certain. "And I love you too. I've known it for a while. I didn't know how to say it without being afraid of what it cost." The fire crackled. The creek ran in the dark. Clem snored softly a few feet away, which should have broken the moment and somehow didn't, because the moment was built of something sturdier than circumstance. Xavier reached across the space between them and took her hand. She let him. Her fingers, after a moment, closed around his, not tentatively, but firmly, the way she did everything that mattered, with intention, with both hands. "We should sleep," she said finally. "Long ride tomorrow." "Yes," he said. But neither of them moved for a while. They sat at the fire in the cold February dark on the road between a courthouse where her past had just been contained and a ranch where their future was waiting, and they held on, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was the beginning of something that had no ceiling. The copies reached the Fort Smith courthouse 8 days after they returned to the ranch, sent by the most reliable mail carrier, Xavier knew. 3 years of household accounts in Olivia's precise handwriting, cross-referenced and annotated, showing clearly and in detail what Harold Norris had done with money that wasn't his, and when and how much. Simmons filed them the day they arrived. Harold's lawyer showed up at the courthouse 2 weeks later to file the fraudulent claim. He walked in, identified himself, stated his purpose, and Simmons handed him a folder. The lawyer looked through the folder for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "How long has this been on file?" 3 weeks, Simmons said pleasantly. "The affidavits. The financial records have been on file 11 days. The lawyer looked at the folder again. Then he stood up, thanked Simmons for his time, and left. He did not file the claim. Word reached Xavier and Olivia through Clem, who heard it from a man who'd been at the courthouse that day and had apparently found the whole scene worth telling. Xavier was in the barn when Clem told him. He stood there for a moment with his hand on Drum's neck and thought about a man with a rented horse and a prepared story riding west through the Arkansas frontier, certain that the woman he'd spent 8 years managing would have nowhere to go and no one to stand behind her. He thought about what it cost to be wrong about that. "Is it over?" Clem said. "The legal part," Xavier said. "Harold is still Harold. He doesn't change." "No," Clem agreed. "But a man with a problem of his own has less time for other people's problems." He said it simply and without drama, the way true things often come out, and Xavier nodded and they went back to work. That evening he told Olivia. She was at the kitchen table. She listened without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's not going to come back." "No," Xavier said. "He's not." She looked at her hands on the table. Something moved across her face, not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. It was more like the feeling of a door closing that had been standing open for a long time, letting the cold in, and finally the latch catching. "Then it's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright in the lamplight, not with tears, or not only with tears, but with the kind of brightness that comes when something long held is released, and the energy of holding it suddenly has nowhere to go but out. 8 years, she said. And now it's done. He said again, because some things need to be said more than once before they become real. She pressed her lips together, nodded once. Then she stood up, walked around the table, and did something she had never done before. She put her arms around him briefly and completely and held on for exactly 3 seconds, and then stepped back and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has just decided that some things are worth the risk. "Supper," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "Supper." He agreed, and his wasn't either, and they made supper together in the warm kitchen, and outside, the February cold was already beginning to loosen at the edges, and somewhere under the frost, the ground was getting ready for spring. And in a ranch house on 160 acres of Arkansas frontier, two people who had found each other on the far side of hard things moved around each other with the easy familiarity of people who have learned the grammar of each other's company and found that they liked the language. Spring came the way it always comes after a hard winter. Not gently, not with announcement, but suddenly and with force, as if the land had been holding its breath for months and finally let go all at once. The first morning, Xavier walked out to find the ground soft under his boots. Instead of frozen, he stood in the yard for a full minute, just feeling it. The give of the earth. The particular smell of thaw. The way the air had changed quality overnight, from something that cut to something that simply moved. Olivia came out behind him with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside him and felt it too. "Spring," she said. "Spring," he confirmed. She handed him his cup. They stood there together in the early light, not saying anything else because nothing else needed saying. The land was waking up, and so were they, and both of them knew that what came next was going to be the real work, not the survival work of winter, not the defensive work of dealing with Harold, but the building work. The actual construction of the life they'd agreed to when they'd stood in a cold church in September and said words they meant. That was the morning Xavier understood with the clarity that only comes after surviving something difficult together, that what he and Olivia had was not what he'd hoped for when he'd ridden toward Fort Smith with $17 and a dangerous idea. It was better. It was something he hadn't known how to want, because he hadn't known it existed a partnership that was also a love built not on the fantasy of completion, but on the daily reality of 2 people who had decided over and over in small ways and large ones to choose each other. He didn't say any of that out loud. He drank his coffee and looked at the land and thought, "This is what I built it for." Not the house. This. The first spring planting was the largest undertaking they'd attempted together, and it nearly broke them, not their relationship, but their bodies, which turned out to be the same thing in a different register. Xavier had expanded the plan over the winter, working through it with Olivia on the account books through the long, cold evenings. They were going to plant 60 acres in corn and 30 in wheat and keep the rest in grass for grazing, and it was an ambitious plan for 2 people, more ambitious than anything Xavier had tried alone, and it required every hour of daylight for 6 consecutive weeks. They worked themselves to the edge of their limits. Some evenings, Xavier came in so tired he sat down at the kitchen table and couldn't immediately remember what he'd sat down for. Some mornings, Olivia's hands were stiff from the previous day's work before she'd done anything at all. They ate fast and slept hard and woke before dawn every day and went back out and did it again. But they also laughed. That was what Xavier hadn't expected, the laughter. Not the forced cheerfulness of people trying to keep morale up, but the genuine, unpredictable laughter that comes when 2 people are tired enough that their defenses are down and something strikes them as funny at exactly the same moment, and there's nothing to do but give in to it. It happened first over a pig. One of the 2 pigs they'd started with had developed a talent for escape that defied all reasonable explanation. The animal had gotten out of the pen 3 times over winter, each time reappearing in a different and inexplicable location, once in the barn, once on the front porch, and once memorably standing in the kitchen doorway at 6 in the morning, looking at Xavier with an expression of complete satisfaction. They'd repaired the pen each time. The pig kept escaping. In the middle of the first week of planting, when both of them were already exhausted, the pig got out again and was found in the half-planted cornfield, systematically routing up the seedlings they'd spent 2 days putting in. Xavier arrived at the field, saw what was happening, and said a word he would not have said in mixed company. Olivia arrived 30 seconds later, took in the scene, looked at the pig, looked at the field and said, "He's been planning this all winter." And then she laughed. Not a polite laugh or a tired laugh, a real one, full and genuine, the kind that bends a person forward and takes their breath for a moment. Xavier looked at her, laughing, and felt something in his chest shift so completely and permanently that he knew in the clear, simple way of things that are just true, that he was going to be looking at this woman laughing for the rest of his life, and he was never going to get tired of it. Then he started laughing too, and they caught the pig together and replanted the seedlings together, and it cost them half a day, and neither of them mentioned the cost. The first person to come to them for help was a young man named Thomas Reeve, 20 years old, who arrived at the ranch in late April with a lame horse and no clear story about where he'd come from. Xavier's instinct when the boy rode up was caution strangers on a frontier ranch could be anything. But Olivia looked at Thomas Reeve for about 10 seconds and said quietly to Xavier, "He's not trouble. He's lost." She was right. Thomas had left his family's failed farm in Missouri 3 months earlier with a plan that hadn't survived contact with reality. He was broke, inexperienced, and genuinely uncertain what to do next, and he'd followed a road until it brought him to the Zimmerman property, which was the first place he'd seen in 2 days, with smoke coming from the chimney. Xavier gave him supper and a place to sleep in the barn, and a day's work the next morning to see what he was made of. He was made of willingness. He didn't know much, but he showed up exactly on time and paid attention, and didn't pretend to understand things. He didn't understand, which were 3 qualities that Xavier valued more than experience, because experience could be taught, and those qualities couldn't. "He can stay," Xavier told Olivia that evening. She looked up from the account book. "I thought so too," she said. "We need another pair of hands for the summer anyway." Thomas stayed. He learned fast, worked hard, and within a month had become not quite family, but something adjacent to it, a presence in the house and on the land that was welcome and functional, and occasionally, like the pig, inadvertently funny. His arrival turned out to be the first stone in a small avalanche. 2 weeks after Thomas, a family named Whitmore arrived, husband, wife, 3 children looking for land nearby. They'd heard about the Arkansas frontier from a man in Fort Smith who'd told them the Zimmerman place was an example of what could be built out here. They ended up on 40 acres a mile and a half east, and within a month they were borrowing tools and returning them, and sharing labor on the hard jobs, and coming over for Sunday dinners, and the ranch, which had been an isolated outpost, began to become something else. The center of something. A node in a network that was slowly, almost without anyone deciding it, becoming a community. Olivia was the one who understood what was happening before Xavier did. "We're becoming a landmark," she said one evening after the Whitmores had gone home, and Thomas had turned in, and they were alone at the kitchen table in their usual positions. Xavier looked at her. "How do you mean? People come here," she said. "Thomas came because there was smoke in the chimney. The Whitmores came because someone in Fort Smith mentioned this place. Every time someone passes through and we help them, feed them, give them water, tell them what we know about the land, they carry that forward." She paused. "We're not just building a ranch, we're building something people navigate by." He thought about that. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "I think it's exactly right." She looked at the lamp. "I think it's what this place was always going to be if we built it well enough." He thought about the house, the 2 rocking chairs, the window over the basin, the second bedroom he'd built for a woman he hadn't met yet. He thought about the intention that had been in the building of it, the way a structure carries inside itself the values of the person who built it. "I built it thinking about what a home needed," he said. "You built it thinking about other people," she said. "That's what it shows." She said it simply, without flattery, the way she said everything important, just the assessment, the plain truth as she saw it. And he received it the way he received all her plain truths, as the most valuable thing she gave him. The twist that summer came not from Harold, who had gone quiet and stayed quiet. The filed accounts had seen to that, but from Ruth Calloway, the distant cousin who had written the warning letter in February. Ruth arrived in June. Not a letter this time. Ruth herself in a wagon with 2 trunks and a manner that was simultaneously apologetic and determined. Xavier saw the wagon coming up the road and went to meet it, and when the woman on the bench introduced herself, he said, "Come inside," before she'd finished the sentence. Ruth Calloway was 50, a widow with strong hands and honest eyes, and the specific guilt of a person who has known something was wrong for a long time and has finally decided that knowing without acting is no longer something they can live with. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at Olivia and said, "I should have spoken 8 years ago. I knew what Harold was doing. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself it wasn't my place." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "I'm not going to tell you that's acceptable. It isn't." Olivia looked at her for a long moment. Xavier watched his wife's face, the complex internal weather of it, the movement of things behind her expression. "Why now?" Olivia said. Not with coldness, with genuine question. "Because the account records you filed ended Harold," Ruth said. "He's under investigation now. The county in our town has opened a case. He has too many other problems to cause you any more." She paused. "And because I needed you to know that someone who could have helped you saw what was happening, so that if there's ever any doubt in your mind about whether you were right, whether your memory of it was accurate, there's someone who can tell you yes. You were right. All of it. Everything you remembered." The silence in the kitchen was the kind that has weight. Olivia's hands were on the table flat, and Xavier watched them press down the grounding gesture and then slowly release. And then she said something that surprised him. "Thank you for coming." Ruth blinked. I'm not angry at you," Olivia said. She said it carefully, working it out as she spoke. "I was for a long time. Not at you specifically. You weren't the only one who said nothing, but at everyone who could see it and chose not to see it." She paused. "I'm not anymore. I don't have room for it. I have other things to put in that space now." Ruth looked at her. Really looked the way you look at someone when you're taking in not just what they said, but who they are. "You're all right," she said. It wasn't a question. It was something more like wonder. "I'm all right," Olivia said. And then for the first time in a long time she smiled, not the small, careful precursor of a smile she'd shown Xavier on the bench in Fort Smith, but a real one, full and unguarded. "I'm considerably better than all right." Ruth stayed 3 days. She was useful, skilled with a kitchen and with livestock, and with the kind of practical problem-solving that frontier life demanded. And by the end of the 3rd day, Xavier had offered her the quarter section east of the creek if she wanted to start something of her own. And Ruth had looked at the land, and at Olivia, and at the community that was quietly forming around the Zimmerman ranch, and said yes, it was the right decision. Xavier knew it immediately, with the same instinct that had told him to build 2 rocking chairs and a window over the basin, the instinct that recognized when something fit the shape of what was being built. The pregnancy Olivia told him about in August was the largest thing that had ever been handed to Xavier Zimmerman in his life, and he received it the way he received everything that mattered, in complete silence for a moment while he found his footing. They were at the kitchen table. It was evening, the lamp between them, the account book open. Olivia set down her pen and said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up. She held his eyes with that direct, undefended look that was the most intimate thing she did. The look she reserved for things that were true and important and slightly frightening. "We're going to have a child," she said. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. He counted them later. Then he said, "When February," she said. "Maybe early March." He nodded slowly. His mind was doing several things at once, calculating, feeling, adjusting, and none of it was organized enough yet to put into words. He said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. I'm well. A pause. I've been well for a while. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. He looked at her. She was watching him with the careful attention of a woman who has assumed how news will land. Olivia, he said. Yes, I am. He stopped, started again. I don't have the right words for this. Something in her face softened, not the careful, controlled softening of someone managing their expression, but the real kind. You don't need words, she said. Your face is doing fine. He reached across the table and took both her hands. She let him. Her fingers closed around his the way they'd closed around the fire that February night on the road, firmly with intention, with both hands. We need a bigger table, he said. She laughed, that full, real laugh that bent her forward and took her breath, the one he would never get tired of. We need more than a bigger table, she said. I'll start with the table, he said, and work outward from there. Yeah. He built the bigger table in September. He expanded the kitchen in October. He built a cradle in November, working on it in the evenings after supper, the same deliberate care he'd put into every board and nail of the house, not rushing, not performing, just building the way he built everything, with the understanding that what a structure was made to hold was more important than how fast you raised it. Thomas helped. He'd become over the months something closer to a younger brother than a hired hand, present in the way of family, useful in the way of family, occasionally infuriating in the way of family, and completely irreplaceable in the way of family. He took on more of the outdoor work as Olivia's pregnancy advanced without being asked and without making a production of it, which was exactly right. The Whitmores came over for Sunday dinners regularly now, and Ruth's place east of the creek was taking shape, and Clem and Martha remained what they had always been, the bedrock of the community, the people who had been there before, and would be there after, the ones who held the memory of how things had started and passed it forward. Martha had taken Olivia under her care with the focused dedication of a woman who had decided this was her project and was not open to argument about it. One Sunday in November, sitting at the expanded kitchen table with the Whitmores and Thomas and Clem and Martha and Ruth, while the wind moved over the land outside and the house was warm and loud with the particular noise of people who are comfortable with each other, Xavier looked around the table and felt something that he had no precise word for. Not contentment. Exactly, not pride exactly, but the feeling of a man who set out to build something and built exactly what he intended, and then discovered it was better than he'd imagined. Olivia caught him looking. She was across the table talking to Martha about something, and she broke off mid-sentence and looked at him with one eyebrow raised in a question. He shook his head slightly. Nothing. Just looking. She held his eyes for a moment, and whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy the question, because she nodded once, the same single nod she'd given him on the church steps in September when she'd accepted this life, and turned back to Martha. He picked up his coffee and listened to the table, and thought, this is what the house was waiting for. Not just Olivia. All of it. This. And the baby came on a Thursday in late February, exactly 5 months after Harold's lawyer had walked out of the Fort Smith courthouse and the threat that had followed them from the beginning finally closed. Martha was there. Ruth was there. Xavier was there, which was not standard for the time or the place. But Olivia had said the week before, "You built this house. You should be here when it becomes what it was always supposed to be." And there was no argument he could have made to that, even if he'd wanted to make one. The labor was long. 15 hours, which was not unusual, and was not easy, and Xavier spent most of it in the kitchen, close enough to be useful, and far enough not to be in the way, learning what it felt like to be afraid of something he could not fix or build or negotiate. The helplessness of it was unlike anything he'd faced on the frontier, and he faced it the only way he knew how, by staying by, being present, by not going anywhere. At 4 a.m, Martha came to the kitchen doorway and said, "A girl, both of them well." Xavier put his coffee cup down and stood up and said nothing for a long moment. "Go in," Martha said, not unkindly. "She's asking for you." He went in. Olivia was exhausted in a way that went beyond ordinary tiredness, hollowed out and luminous. At the same time, the way people look after they've done something that required everything they had. She was holding the baby with the careful, total attention she brought to everything important. When Xavier came in, she looked up. "Come here," she said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small, fierce face of his daughter and felt something move through him that had no relationship to any feeling he'd had before. Not better or worse than other feelings, but larger, a different category of experience entirely. The feeling of understanding for the first time what you were built to protect. "She's perfect," he said. "She's loud," Olivia said. "She's been loud since the moment she arrived." "Good," Xavier said. "She's going to need to be." Olivia looked at him. Her face was tired and open and completely unguarded, the way it had been at the fire in February, the way it was when she was too tired to hold anything back. "What do we call her?" she said. They'd talked about names. They'd had a list. In the moment, looking at the child, Xavier found that only one name felt right, and he said it, Clara. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Then, "Clara was the first woman in Fort Smith who said no." "I know," he said. "She was honest about what she needed. I respected that." He looked at his daughter. "I want this one to always be honest about what she needs, and for that to be respected." Olivia looked at him with the bright, full eyes that meant something was moving in her that she was not going to apologize for. "Clara," she said. She said it to the baby, not to Xavier, testing it, handing it to the child. The baby, in response, opened her eyes for the first time and stared at her mother with the unfocused, absolute attention of the newborn, and Olivia said, "All right, Clara." Xavier put his arm around his wife, and she leaned into him, and outside the late February dark was beginning to thin at the edges toward dawn, and in the barn, drums shifted, and the chickens stirred, and the land that had been frozen all winter was somewhere beneath the surface, already deciding to wake up. The years that followed were not easy. They were not supposed to be. The ranch grew not quickly, not without setbacks, but steadily with the particular growth of things built on honest foundations. They added acres as they could afford them. They raised livestock, expanded the crops, built a second barn when the first one couldn't hold what they'd produced. Thomas Reeve married a woman named Ellen in the spring of Clara's second year and built his own place a quarter-mile north, and the Zimmerman Ranch gained a neighbor who was also something closer than a neighbor. Ruth Calloway's place east of the creek became a going concern. She had a garden that the whole community raided when things were short, and a stubbornness about lending that meant anything you borrowed from Ruth came back in better condition than it left. She became over the years the person the community sent for when something needed thinking through clearly, which was a reputation she'd earned and accepted with the same practical manner she brought to everything. Clara grew up loud and certain and fearless in the way of children who have never been made to feel that taking up space is an imposition. She learned to ride before she was 4, kept accounts before she was 8, and by the time she was 10 she was telling Xavier where he was making mistakes in the field rotation, with a directness that was so precisely her mother's that he had to look away sometimes to keep from laughing. The second child, a boy they named James. After no one, and for no particular reason except that the name fit him, arrived 2 years after Clara and was everything Clara. Was not quiet, watchful, careful with his father's instinct for the land and his mother's habit of seeing what others missed. Where Clara announced, James observed. They fought constantly and were inseparable, which Xavier understood as the highest form of sibling relationship. Olivia ran the finances of the ranch and gradually became the person other families in the growing settlement came to when their own numbers didn't add up. Not because she advertised the ability she never did, but because word traveled the way it always traveled in a frontier community. And the word about Olivia Zimmerman was that she was the most honest person with a ledger that anyone had ever encountered, and that she would tell you the truth about your situation, even when the truth was uncomfortable, and that her advice had never been wrong. Harold Norris, by the account that reached them through Ruth, was convicted of embezzlement in the spring of 1880 and sentenced to 2 years. Ruth delivered this information to Olivia over coffee one morning with the careful neutrality of someone presenting a fact of uncertain emotional weight. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I hope when he comes out he makes something better of himself." She said it without irony, without satisfaction, with the plain sincerity of a woman who has moved so far past something that she can wish the person who did it well without it costing her anything. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "You mean that?" "I mean that," Olivia confirmed. "I don't need him to suffer. I needed him to stop. He stopped." She picked up her coffee. "That's enough." Ruth considered this for a long time. Then she said, "I think you might be the most genuinely good person I've ever met." Olivia looked mildly surprised, the way she always looked when complimented, as if the idea of herself as an object of admiration was still slightly foreign. "I'm practical," she said. "Practical and genuinely good are not mutually exclusive," Ruth said. Olivia smiled, the full one, the real one. "No," she said. "I suppose they're not." It was a Sunday in October of 1883, 5 years after Xavier had ridden toward Fort Smith with $17, and a dangerous idea that the thing happened which made him understand finally and completely what he'd actually built. He was on the front porch in one of the 2 rocking chairs. Clara was inside doing something loud that involved a disagreement with James. Olivia was in the other chair, the account book in her lap, her pen moving with the quick precision it always had. The afternoon was warm for October, the air carrying the particular quality of late autumn, that is like no other season, clear and still, and smelling faintly of dried grass and distance. The land stretched out in front of them, changed now from what it had been in 1878. The fields in their winter fallow, the second barn visible past the first, the smoke from Thomas's place a mile north, rising straight in the still air, the glint of Ruth's roof east of the creek. A wagon appeared on the road. Xavier watched it come without moving. Strangers appeared more regularly now. The frontier was less frontier than it had been 5 years ago, the roads more traveled, the distances less absolute. The wagon pulled up at the yard gate and a man and a woman climbed down, the man maybe 25. The woman younger, both of them with the particular look he had learned to recognize immediately, the look of people who had been traveling for a long time towards something they weren't sure they'd find. He got up from his chair and walked to the gate. "We're looking for the Zimmerman place," the man said. Someone in the last settlement said, "You found it," Xavier said. He opened the gate. "Come in." He brought them to the porch. Olivia had already set down the account book. Clara appeared in the doorway, 8 years old, brown-haired, her mother's eyes, and assessed the strangers with the frank appraisal of a child who had grown up watching her mother assess everything directly. Olivia asked the couple the questions that needed asking: where they were from, where they were going, what they were looking for. She asked them plainly, and listened to the answers completely, and when they'd finished, she looked at Xavier, and something passed between them. Wordless, immediate, the communication of 2 people who have been reading each other for 5 years and have gotten very good at it. "There's land east of the creek," Xavier said. "Ruth Calloway could tell you about it. Her place is about a mile that direction." He paused. "But first come inside and eat something." The woman, her name was Anna, it turned out, and she had the hands of someone who had worked hard and the eyes of someone who wasn't done. Yet looked at the house and then at Olivia and said, "You've been here a while." 5 years, Olivia said. "Is it?" Anna stopped. Tried again. "Is it all right? Out here, really?" Olivia looked at her for a long moment. She looked at this woman who was standing at the beginning of something and wanted to know if it was worth it, and she gave her the answer she would have wanted someone to give her standing on a bench in Fort Smith in September of 1878, the true one. "It's hard," she said. "Most days it's harder than you think you can handle. The winters are real, and the work is more than you imagine, and there are days when everything goes wrong at once." She paused. "And yes, it's all right. It's considerably better than all right." She looked at Xavier. "We built something here, something real. Not because the land was easy or the circumstances were kind, but because we decided to stay and build it anyway." She looked back at Anna. "That's the whole answer. That's all there is." Anna looked at her husband. He looked at her. Something passed between them, The particular communication of two people deciding something together, and then they both looked back at Olivia and nodded. "Come inside," Olivia said, and held the door. Xavier stood on the porch for a moment after they went in. He could hear Olivia's voice inside, and Clara's, and the sounds of the kitchen being organized around feeding people, and underneath all of it, the particular living noise of a house that was full. He looked at the land, at the fields and the barns, and the smoke from Thomas's chimney, and the glint of Ruth's roof, and the road coming in from the east, where strangers arrived and left less strange than they'd arrived. He thought about a man who had driven a nail into an empty house and said out loud to nobody that he'd built it thinking about a woman he hadn't met yet. He had met her. He had built the rest with her. And what they had made together out of hard ground and honest words and the daily choice to stay was not what he'd imagined when he'd ridden toward Fort Smith with $17 and hope. It was more. It was a life so full and real and alive that it had started spilling over into other lives, drawing people in, giving them something to navigate by. The way a light in a window on a dark road is not just a light, but a direction, a proof that somewhere ahead there is warmth and someone who will open the door. He went inside. Clara was already telling Anna about the pig, the escape artist, the cornfield raid, the legendary stubbornness of the animal who had been accidentally the first thing that made her parents laugh together. She was telling it with the dramatic precision of a child who has heard a story so many times she has made it her own, and Olivia was at the stove not listening to it, and also hearing every word with the small private smile that meant something was good, and she knew it, and she wasn't going to say so because she didn't need to. Xavier sat down at the big table, the one he'd built in September of 1878, and expanded in October of 1878, and replaced entirely in the spring of 1880, because the family had outgrown it, and picked up his coffee cup, and looked at his wife and his daughter, and the two strangers, who were already starting to be less strange, and understood, with the simple finality of a thing completely known, that a home is not built in a season or a year. It is built every day by people who choose to stay, and keep choosing, and never stop building. And what Xavier Zimmerman had built from a single nail driven into an empty house on a September morning in 1878 was exactly that. A life that proved day by ordinary, extraordinary day that the most important thing a man could ever construct was not a structure at all, but the love that made it worth coming home to.